Uh, Swanu, thanks for this amazing sort of overview of so many different things. Amazing. Thanks so much for doing this. So, what started you on this journey? What made you? You could have done so many things. How did you get to doing history?
It was family history because I grew up in Pune, where our textbooks in school always had these things like in 19th century widow remarriage was a great reform. And I'd go back to Kerala where my grandmother would tell me things like her grandmother, my great-great-grandmother who I mentioned earlier, was a divorcee in the 1880s. And their marriage was a fascinating story. She was first married to this Brahmin gentleman. They had a stillborn daughter. And the thing is, in the matrilineal system, if you have a stillborn daughter, it's a bad omen because daughters are essential to continue the line. So when the Brahmin came back to fetch her, the mother stopped him at the threshold of the house and said, "You're not needed here anymore, go back." It was as simple as that. There was no divorce ritual or paperwork. Get out of the house, I don't want to see you again. And this became a little bit of a tragic love story between them. And 33 years later, when that man was dying, he sent a message asking for my great-great-grandmother to see her one last time. So, it was some sort of a close bond they had. So then she ended up marrying my great-great-grandfather. He married her for her property because there was this one unmarried woman, once married woman, who had lots of property and she was alone in this house. So his brother said, "You just come and give this cloth, I'll take care of the rest," which meant I'll take care of her property. Now, as it happened, when he came and gave cloth, he looked at her face and he thought, "Oh, she's actually good looking." So then he went back and discarded his first wife, from which he had a son, and parked himself in this house. And they had a terrible marriage. There was wife beating. She would then go and douse his favorite, canopy bed with lots of oil and sorts of things like that. They had a hilarious, bizarre marriage. And I was fascinated. I was like, where is the widowhood in this? Which of her husbands would she become a widow for? She's married twice. And this is in the 1880s. She's a Sanskrit scholar, a chaste Hindu, she does all her pujas. But in Kerala, that's what it was. This opened up in my mind a very interesting curiosity about how, there's something I'm learning in the textbooks and there's something else that I'm seeing in my own family history. Then I started, going further back, and then, as I said, when it came, my family was a regular Nair family, but as it went to the level of royalty, the stories became even more colorful, even more interesting. And then I realized, and I found this queen of Travancore who had decided, at one point she had a 21-gun salute and 300 servants and the whole 5 million subjects, where everyone would fall at her feet, and then she dies in obscurity in Bangalore, like a nobody. And I thought this was a wonderful story, because most people, even today, find it very difficult to give up power. Here's this woman who deliberately, consciously gave up her palaces, her riches, moved to Bangalore, chose to live like an exile there, chose to become a nobody, and died like that. So I thought that story needed to be told. And the thing is, once you start telling a story, your desire to tell more sort of gets kindled, and then there's no escaping it. So I will inflict more books on everyone every 2 years, I think.
So you started at 19 and you finished your first book at 25. So what does it really take to do, what do you mean by doing history, and what is the process? What did you do for those?
It is the death of your social life. Because for those 6 years, I was often, I lost a lot of friends, because the thing is, you don't show up for somebody's thing one day and you have an excuse. When it happens 5 times, people start getting annoyed. But I was quite wedded to my project. I didn't want to give up. So I was living first at university, where I do my classes, rush off to the archives in London, the British Library, stay there till they shut at about 8 o'clock in the library in the archives, then come back, cook, repeat. That's how it would work. I couldn't go out on Friday nights because, people drank on Friday nights. And if I drank, then I wouldn't wake up on time on Saturday, which meant I couldn't go to the archives on Saturday, la la la. So it was the death of my social life. But more seriously, it entails a lot of hard work. You can tell stories in an entertaining way, but the backroom heavy lifting is fairly heavy. It's not easy to do. 6 years is what it took. The 19-year-old who went in was not the 25-year-old who emerged at the end of the whole process. And I had to learn to negotiate archives, interviews with people, learning to read people's diaries, reading love letters of the Travancore Maharani in English to her husband in the 1860s, and you hold such paper in your hand, and you wonder, my gosh, this is so remarkable. They didn't wake up. And this is the thing, again, I keep saying this about Indian history in general. We have this preoccupation with golden ages and so on. Nobody woke up in the morning thinking, I'm living in a golden age. They were going about their business. They were human beings who were living their lives. We have ascribed values such as golden age. So if you look at them as other human beings, your connection to them becomes richer. So I try to focus, I try to sort of weave my history through the stories of these characters, for the simple reason that the history comes alive through their eyes. And that makes it truly special. But these are things that I had to learn. It took me 6 years, as you said. It took a series of drafts. The final version of The Ivory Throne is the 5th draft. And there are still parts of it that I'm not happy with. One thing I've decided is I'm never going to write a 700-page book again. Because, a number of my older readers say that it's very difficult for them to hold up the book and read it in bed. And the print is too small. And, 700 pages can get a little too much for even the most enthusiastic reader. So, there's that sort of stuff you learn, which is why Rebel Sultans is half the size. Then you learn that, you're dealing with history, which is a matter of great responsibility. Which is, there is politics in history. No historian is completely unbiased. Your own prejudices, your own biases creep in. There's no escaping the fact that, objectivity is always an intention. It is never an achieved reality. At the end of the day, no matter how objective I think my book is, it's not. Somewhere, either as a man, I've forgotten all about the female side of things. As an upper caste, I may not even have recognized that in the Deccan, what were the low caste doing? I'm talking about kings and sultans. Luckily, I limit myself to that. But when you say Deccan history, that involves many layers of people. How many can you cover? So there's lots of awareness of your own limitations, awareness of the limitations of the material you're working with, and awareness of your human limitations, which is that, at the end of the day, I only ended The Ivory Throne in 2015 because I was like, in turning 25, it's taken 6 years of my life, I'm done with this thing. And it's haunting me, it's taken up enough of my time, move on. So that's how I ended it, not because I woke up and said, finally, great draft. No, it's like, I'm done. This is too much of a heavy thing on my head. So, it's a mixed bag that way. But at the end of the day, it is fun, in a way, to sort of go through dusty files and, go looking for old people who were nephews of various British residents, discover like a lost photograph in their archives, things like that. After my book was published, I found the diaries of one of the Travancore Maharaja's tutors. Very colourful recording of what happened in the book, at the time in the palace. But I couldn't include it in the book because it was too late. And you'll find them in weird ways. I was once at dinner at this conservation expert's house, and she's showing me things on her iPad. I said, hold on, this is the diary I was looking for. It was auctioned by Bonhams. They wouldn't tell me who bought it at auction. So I could never find it. And she knew who had bought it. And then she connected it and I got the PDF scan copy of the thing. So, there's plenty of adventures. I've seen so many paintings, such wonderful art, wonderful buildings. And it tells you a lot about life itself. So the Maharani of Travancore built these wonderful palaces for herself and her children. They abandoned it and moved on to Bangalore. What used to be her palace was now at the Agriculture College, is now a girls' hostel. What used to be huge halls have been cut up into small rooms where girls who have no idea that a Maharani once lived there, that's where they sleep and do their homework or whatever. That's how that place has become now. It tells you also that for all of us who think we're creating history today, today's monument is tomorrow's, hostel for ladies. So, that realization is also philosophical understanding about life itself. Which is that, as you deal with history, you also realize the impermanence of things. This quest to mark our place on planet Earth and constantly leave behind some sort of an impression, it's a futile task at the end of the day. Even Akbar's tomb was desecrated by the Jats, a few generations later. And that's how it was. So, it tells you a lot. It tells you a lot about human beings. It tells you about yourself a lot. And it teaches you to be patient at the end of the day.
Something that Manu is not telling us is that when he went and did a master's in the UK, but he didn't do it in history. He tried to do it in history, but I think his parents weren't too happy about it, and then he convinced them to send him to the UK to do a master's in management.
No, what? Kushu, have you even read my bio?
Sorry. In international relations. Yes. Sorry, but the point is that,
no offense to management people. It's just that there's been a crop of management people writing some terrible novels, and I don't want to be included in that.
So the question is, not having studied or not having been really studying history in a formal way, how has that affected has that been an advantage or a disadvantage, or how does that?
And it doesn't. There are some. One of the disadvantages of being young is that you have a lot of peers who are not very happy that you've got 2 published books, because in academia, publication is like a big thing. So I often see this with some of my contemporaries. They say, oh, but you only publish with a trade press, not with an academic press, so it doesn't really count and things like that. So there are people who say, but you're not an official historian. Your PhD, or my PhD is also not official in history. It's in state formation in the 19th century. It's political economy / history. So it's a mixed up thing. But Ramchandra Guha never studied history. Sanjay Subramaniam, who won a very prestigious award, he never studied history. These are people who studied. Ramchandra Guha has written about cricket and the environment and things like that. His PhD is in sociology. Sanjay Subramaniam is an economist, and these are the greatest historians of our time, of our contemporary Indian history. These are the names that stand out. In my case also, what happened was my master's included the writing of a thesis. At the end of the day, when you're doing a thesis, you're taught research methods. Those research methods are what you apply to history as well. At the end of the day, the way you sift through archives, the way you sift through documents, these things are taught to you as research methods. So I chose to apply it to history, and I'm very certain that this is where I will continue working, even though I may do fiction at some point. I don't think not having learned history officially is a problem. I did have it as a minor subject in college, but I chose quite deliberately not to do a major in history because our textbooks were disastrous. They were not interesting. They would have sapped any interest I had in the subject. It would have destroyed any plans I had to do history. I enjoyed history for the vitality and the fascinating stories that were there. I didn't want it to be destroyed by clunky textbooks that had 5 different dates and 5 battles and sort of, regurgitating all of that on an exam paper.
I mean, clearly your passion for history was visible today, and
I was flailing about quite a bit. No?
So do you this next question is, do you see, what is the vision? Do you have a vision for your work? Do you see your work as a continuity of themes, or what is the overall vision for your work? That's the question. And also, how do you choose your subject? So your one was in the south, now is the Deccan, and so what is the vision for your work, and how do you choose your subjects, and what are you going to be working on?
I think when I'm 60, I'll probably answer this question with yes, I had a vision, and this was my grand plan and all of that. The truth in most cases is that things are not the narrative that we construct around it. Often things are merely accident. I was first gripped by this particular story, so I happily gave 6 years of my life because I wanted to tell that story. And then what I was learning, what I was reading in the process, it was remarkable, and I knew that I couldn't give it up. The Deccan, because I was always fascinated by these footnoted sultans who existed. We know about the Mughals and we know about Shivaji, but who were these occasional cameos that you get of the Adil Shahs and Nizam Shahs? And I always knew I was interested in them. But at some level, the Deccan book also happened because of the times we live in. Because there is this polarizing that's happening in our society. There is this drawing of boundaries and looking at the past in a black and white situation. And although I knew I would do a Deccan book at some point, the idea was to do it as book 3. I decided, well, this actually makes sense to do it now as book 2, because the time seemed to suggest the need for a book that says, hold on, things were a little more complex than our politicians and our Twitter historians would like you to believe. So that was the motivation behind that. I will not pretend at all that it wasn't political. It wasn't an apolitical decision. The book does have a political message, and at the end of the day, I have no issues saying that I'm not claiming to be a completely objective person at all. No historian is. If any historian tells you they're objective, they're lying. Every historian comes with some message they're trying to convey. In my case, my interpretation of the past is this way. You can connect the dots this way, connect the dots this way. The question is, what is most likely? What adds up best? That is what we go with. So, there was that. My next book is going to be a more pan-Indian exercise. And that, so again, as you said, looks like a progression. I'm starting from a small corner, going to a bigger region, and then finally going pan-Indian. But these are merely accidents. These are merely things that interested me. The next major book that I'm doing, I did one chunk of research in 2012. I was fed up with my Travancore Maharanis, threw them out of the window for 3 or 4 months, and started working on this other idea, saying, forget this book, I'll do this one. And then I collected a chunk of information then, and then I started, occasionally continuing that research, and I completed it last year. Now I need to sit down and start writing, which is a scary proposition because writing is a very isolating task. So that is never fun. You're always chained to a desk. And when I was finishing The Ivory Throne, I was sitting 12 hours, 18 hours in my pajamas, morning to evening, on eating chocolate to get sugar highs and keep my energy high. And I lost 12 kgs in the process. It was the most fascinating experiment.
So I'm glad we've got you here before you start writing your next book.
Yeah.
So talking about politics, and you mentioned, there is a level of, a political ideology in your book. So you also worked with Shashi Tharoor and in the House of Lords with Bill Moria. So what was that like, and why did you decide to do that?
So the writing in history is one foot that I have in this one business here, but the other is international relations. It is foreign policy. That's the thing I did for my bread and butter for the longest time. I only gave up full-time employment last year, because at the end of the day, if you're taking a calculated risk, you might as well take it in your 20s, and I've got only 1 more year left. So if I flop, then I can always go back at 30 saying, "Achha, give me a job." So so I was always interested in politics, and I joined him first in 2011. So I've known him for 8 years now. As part of his election campaign, and he's chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in Parliament, I was his chief of staff. So I'm also part of international networks such as the Munich Security Conference, which is this annual security thing that happens in Germany, and a bunch of other things. So I keep going for all these conferences in suits, which I don't otherwise wear. Because I like having one foot in that. As I said, I am interested in politics. I am interested in having some sort of a contribution to the way our country shapes up in the future. Even though it's a minor contribution, I may myself be footnoted. But it's
what would your day look like when you were working for Tarun?
That was, so I'd wake up obviously and go rush to the office. I'd have breakfast in office. So luckily I stayed in his house. So he nicely given me an outhouse with its own kitchen and all of that. His cook cooked for me, so that was sweet. So the breakfast would come to me at my desk in the office, sit there, end at 9 o'clock in the evening. So we had parliament questions to do, speeches to write. Constituents would call, with issues that were pending in various ministries. So go call up various babus and so on. And the babus were not always welcoming. So on the phone, because of my voice, they sometimes assume I'm a 60-year-old retired IAS officer. And I never, sort of disabuse them of the notion. And then sometimes I'd go to the ministries and they'd see me and they'd be like, "Tum." And they'd be offended that they'd given me so much respect because I looked far too young for that sort of respect. But it was fun because I got to hang out with diplomats, with various NGO people, with journalists, with petitioners who come with things like "Hamara pension nahi mil raha hai." Every week we'd have at least 1-2 cases of Malayali maids who were stranded in the Gulf, where the people who hired them weren't paying them and essentially had enslaved them. And then we'd have to sort of work with various embassies to try and get them released, get them emergency documents issued, and get them back to Trivandrum or Kerala or wherever. So it was a mixed bag of things. It was very exciting, it was very taxing, which is why my writing always happened from 9 to 3 in the morning, because the day was quite full. And it ruined my sleeping schedule, which I still sort of suffer. I still can't sleep very well, but it's one of those things I don't regret. I think at the end of the day, everything is a store of experience. You become wiser for the things you've seen in life. And being part of a campaign where, on the one side there's kissing of babies, on the other hand there's goons, there's people. When I first went for the election campaign in 2014, I was on day one I was a little naive. So a bunch of boys came saying, "Oh, you're handling this segment of the campaign, we want to volunteer." I said, "Great, volunteers are just falling into my lap like nothing." Only to realize that they expected payment in alcohol, and I said, "Sorry, wrong department, I'm not the one you need to talk to." So you learn a lot of things like that, you see a lot of things. And I think that is worth having that sort of experience in life. So along with the writing, it does expose you to a lot of things. You see things, you see people, and you realize that
That's amazing. In one sense, you had your one foot, 200 years
in the past,
and then one foot like kind of living history and really seeing so many issues that are happening in India. That's amazing. So this is going to be my last question, and then we'll open it up. When you were coming to speak, I asked you, what, and the same question here. Why is it so important for us to really know our history, especially in this time? What do you think about? What can you say about that? What is so important about?
To begin with, history exists in its own context, which is that we always find that history is used either as an instrument of vengeance, which is it is being used as now, or as an instrument of legitimacy. And why is it that history is such a political topic? And it's been political throughout. You can't blame a single party for this because all parties have done this, all political groups have done this, and it's natural. History is a commodity that gives you legitimacy. You can make yourself part of some grand process, some grand narrative, and for that you need to manipulate history. So history has always been a political exercise, which also takes me back to my earlier point that there is no history devoid of politics. Politics is pretty much, there's an umbilical bond between the two. You can't quite separate the two. So given that is the case, we should be able to understand the past for what it is. The past exists in its own context. So we have to determine whether we want to fight today about imagined grievances in the past, or whether we want to fight for a future, whether we want to live today on today's terms, whether we want to move on and learn from the past, draw wisdom from the past, or whether we want to invent or borrow all kinds of imagined feuds from the past. At the end of the day, history is merely, it becomes like putty in the hands of the person dealing with it. Were there wars in the past? Yes. Were there bigots in the past? Yes. But there were also other people. For every bigot that was there was an Ibrahim Adil Shah who called himself son of Saraswati. For every Islamic sultan who went around destroying temples, there were other sultans who built temples. There were Hindu kings who built mosques. So what we choose from history is up to us. We have to first and foremost, I think, decide that history was done. It's a matter of the past. There's a certain security and confidence we need to develop, that we don't need the crutches of history to make ourselves feel a sense of self-worth. At the end of the day, one of the reasons history is also politicized is because we have an identity crisis of who we are as a nation. We still haven't figured out what we are, who we are. We're trying to create this grand box and put everyone into either various compartments in that box or into some pan-Indian box of call it whatever you want. And that's sadly not going to work because people, A, don't sit in boxes. And that's the thing history teaches you. You can't force feed identity onto people. You can't force people into boxes. History is about various layers. It's always about influences. And we need to acknowledge and realize and understand it. So for everybody who's upset about, Indian women forgetting their roots and walking about in jeans, well, hi, topless women, Kerala. So there's so much to learn. There's so much to tell. And we just simply need that sense of maturity to be able to handle history for what it was without succumbing to this personal insecurity that always wants history to justify something we need in here and now in our present. History will never be, you can choose to use it to sort of bolster your own present day insecurities, but then you're doing an injustice to yourself and to history. Everyone's speechless.
I've got a question about this breast story of Kerala. There's another narrative of this that says that I'm not sure of the details, but that says that women were not allowed to wear blouses, and there was a movement of women to wear blouses, and someone chopped off her breast in protest. How do these two
This
link
is the
up?
story of Nangeli.
How does your story and
No,
this
but
link up?
what you're describing, which is again part of today's internet history, is again slightly inaccurate for the simple reason. So the Nangeli story where she cuts off her breasts, this is the story of a low caste woman where the tax collectors come to collect the breast tax. And she says, well, here, breasts, cutting it off, giving it to them, and she becomes a local heroine. Now the thing is, the story is complicated. On the face of it looks like it was about breasts and she gave them breasts on a plantain leaf as a mark of protest. But in reality, the breast tax was never about covering the breasts. It was a simple poll tax that was on all lower castes. For men, it was called talakaram, which means head tax. And to distinguish the tax for women, it was called molakaram, which means breast tax. It had nothing to do with covering the breasts. As I said, even Brahmin women didn't cover their breasts till the 1920s. There are these wonderful, I didn't include it in my presentation today, wonderful photographs of the Maharanis of Cochin. These grand group photographs where they're all sons, brothers, daughters, everybody sitting together, all uniformly topless. Because even the kings and queens did not cover themselves above the waist. The protest you're talking about is a mid-19th century one, later than the cutting story, where the Nadar community in South Travancore said they wanted to start covering their breasts. There was no issue with the covering itself. The thing is, they covered themselves with what is called Neryada, which is an upper shawl. And that was a mark of caste privilege. The Neryad was worn by Nayar women. So the Nayars objected not because they were covering their breasts, but because they were covering it in the fashion of the Nayar women. So when the Maharaja said, hold on, wear kuppayams, which is blouses, then nobody had any problems. They were free to wear kuppayams and blouses. But they could not cover themselves like upper caste women. Because in India, costume was never merely about clothes. It was also about custom. So caste, a person's caste, when you're walking on a street, the way you determine a person's caste is by their hairstyle. So you tell a Nambudri Brahmin, apart from a Tamil Iyengar, because a Nambudri's kudumi is here, the Tamils is at the back. The ornaments that a Brahmin woman will wear are different from the ornaments a Nayar woman will wear. The lower caste will wear wooden beads. So costume, the length of the munda that's worn, if your munda goes under your knee, then you're an upper caste. If it's above the knee, you're a lower caste. So it's on the basis of costume that caste is determined. So when Nadar women started dressing up like Nayar women, it was an affront to caste privilege. It again wasn't about breasts. It was the Victorian obsession with covering breasts that made all of this about breasts. The breasts were not the essential problem here. The problem was, why are you covering like us? We cover like this because we are upper caste. You can't cover like us. That was the thing. And Nangeli wasn't protesting about a right to wear blouses. In her time, wearing a blouse was irrelevant. Nobody wore blouses. She was protesting against a tax that was unjust. And it was just merely happened to be called breast tax. So people have interpreted this as a tax on breasts, which is not true.
I have a question about how you said that we have to realize they are all human beings. But when you study history, like I also studied in Pune, and when you see history books, it's like reading a mythology, and we are creating myths about the history, and those myths are going forward as history, So as a writing 2 books on history, you must have come across a lot of myths.
The myths are always there, and the thing is, one of the things in Indian history is that Indian kings were also lovers of myth. So in the 1290s, Alauddin Khilji comes to Devagiri, Daulatabad, for the first time in 1296. But already in 1290, you have a poem by the Yadava king says, you know, when I come out with my armies, the Turks are all trembling in fear, and he's never seen a Turk in his life. You know, but in his poetry, he's already included them because he wants to sort of play up his own importance. Sultan Balban of Delhi, for example, in one of his inscriptions, he says, when my armies come out, the Keralas are running into caves, the Karnatas are collapsing in fear. And the Keralites in Karnataka, people have no idea who Balban is or where he is and what he's doing. It's just that kings like to play up this exaggerated sense of thing. Because when Shivaji is Shiva Bharata, he talks about how even the people in Madras, the British, are shaking and completely upset with him and all of that. But again, he wasn't till that time a big threat to the British. So all of this is exaggerated a great deal. Which is why, you know, my earlier point on how a historian looks at a text. You never take a text at face value. Texts are always exaggerated because, you know, texts in those days weren't written for general literacy purposes, for general amusement of people. Texts were written by who? Only the elites. Most people were illiterate. Their histories and folklore and songs and so on. Texts were an elite affair. They were an affair for people in power. So all texts at the time, all of these official chronicles, all of these official poems, they all have a political purpose they're serving. Which is why, you know, if historians are buying this mythology at face value, they're making a mistake. Because the text is more than its immediate sentences. You have to read between the lines. And that's when you start gauging a better sense of things. And you start reading them with archaeological evidence. You start reading them with other kinds of evidence. You know, you get a poem, check what the inscriptional evidence says. Check what the archaeological evidence says. Check what general trends around the world at the time say. That gives you greater clarity than relying on a single source for anything.
I have a question that sort of spans history and politics and stuff. The whole politics about Hindi as a national language when there's no one Hindi language anyway. But I'd like to hear.
You know, this is again that, you know, the 19th century, which is a very fascinating period in Indian history because so much of what we think of as Indian tradition was actually manufactured in the 19th century. Languages, you know, the Marathi, for example, in the Vishnu Shastri Chiplumkar, for example, you know, people, social reformers at the time, scholars of the time, they made a conscious decision at the time to remove Arabic and Persian origin words and replace them with Sanskritic words. That's how Hindi was also created. Urdu became ultra-Persianized because some Muslims said ultra-Arabic, ultra-Persian. Hindi became more Sanskritized because they said Hindi must be pure. But in reality, they are actually children of the same mother, which is a mixed up thing.
Hindi, every district, every city
was different.
is a different Hindi. So they're actually not.
What we now call Hindi is what they call Khari Boli. Khari Boli is today's standardized Hindi.
The Hindi in Bihar.
It's very different.
Nobody in Rajasthan would understand the Hindi of it. So is it even one language?
No, it is, well, the thing is, see, the languages have sprung from a common source, but they've obviously mingled with earlier languages that existed there. So this is true anywhere. Like, I'm a Malayali. If I go to Trivandrum, I have no idea what they're saying because the slang is so different from my area in Kerala that, you know, you don't quite understand what they're saying. There's more Tamil words in it, Tamil inflections in it. So there's, you know, language is one of those peculiar animals. But it's true. I mean, the national language debate is a hilarious one because officially there is no national language. There are recognized official languages and there are dozens of them. It's not merely Hindi. Hindi is merely language of government along with English. And, you know, one of the ironies is that the freedom movement, all the nationalist leaders, they have no common language. It was the English language that helped them. The first, if you read the report of the first Indian National Congress in the 1880s, one of the requirements for all delegates was all delegates must speak English. Because they're like, if you're coming from, look at it this way, Gandhiji, born in Gujarat. Nehru raised in Allahabad of Kashmiri origin. C. Rajagopalachari comes from Tamil Nadu. Subhash Chandra Bose is a Bengali. These are people who all come from different language areas. If it weren't for the English language, they would have had no way of communicating with each other. What, in Sanskrit? Doesn't work. You know, as I said, Sanskrit may have worked at some Brahmanical elite level, but it had ceased to have power. For power, English was the language at the time. So a lot of our nationalist history was, in a sense, it was catalyzed by the existence of the English language. Which is why now they're trying to replace that with Hindi, trying to say Hindi must take that place, so we have an Indian language, which was something even Mahatma Gandhi wanted. He said that all the Dravidians being in a minority, they must learn the language of the majority. At which time Tamil politicians said, by this logic, the national bird should be the majority crow, not the minority peacock. So, you know, these things have never been accepted across the board, and it's one of those things, you know, let sleeping dogs lie. Why do you want to rake up trouble and break up the country in these silly debates when there's so much else to do? What does it matter? You can be a good Indian, whether you speak English or Malayalam or Gujarati or whatever. It doesn't matter.
I've got a question on something on pan-Indian history. Ramchandra Gupta has been, I've heard him say in a YouTube presentation that India is an experiment like European Union. and it is not a sort of an organized framework, and you mentioned it briefly, a big box. Now, in your research of history for your next book, for example, do you think that the fractious tendencies in India are more dominant than we are willing to accept? And does that give you a sense that things can go wrong very quickly, unravel very quickly?
I think India could very quickly get to a fragile place sooner than we think if certain existing fault lines are exaggerated in the way they are now. You know, as this one Hindi debate, for example,
Yeah.
why are they emphasizing it? Why are you unnecessarily creating a South versus North thing, for example? There are various cultural impositions as well. You know,
Yeah.
why in Kerala, for example, now you go to a wedding, there's sindoor and bindis and lots of rituals. These have all come in from the north, but Malayalis have accepted it. But all the same, I do think that, I mean, there are some people who say that India, modern India, is a creation of the British. Our boundaries may be a creation of the British, but India itself is not. There was some sense of civilizational unity that existed. There was some connecting thread that existed. Whether you went to any corner of India, there was always one Brahmin who had a common language with other Brahmins. They may not dress like him, look like him. The Brahmins had their own feuds, but they all spoke Sanskrit. They all had the same corpus of texts, which did lend at some super elite level a common sense of identity. But there's this wonderful new book by Tony Joseph called Early Indians, which tells you how we are, at the end of the day, everybody in India is a minority. Nobody exists as a majority. But because there are certain ideologies that want to force feed these homogenized nationalistic ideas, hyper-nationalistic ideas, not nationalistic. I use the word nationalism here not in the sense of patriotism. You can be a patriot without being a hyper-nationalist. Hyper-nationalism is what would break the country. Because, you know, if it comes to that, why should a Kannada kid learn a language? Why would he not learn English? English will at least give him access to a globalized job market. Why will he learn a Hindi, which is equally alien to him? He'll at least learn the language that has some utility to him. By insisting that you learn Hindi, then, you know, that becomes a problem. Similarly, you impose one version of Hinduism on the country. The thing is, Hinduism is a very diverse faith. The Hinduism that exists in Kerala with its menstruating goddesses and groves and so on is not the Hinduism that exists in Kashmir, for example. The rituals that are followed by the Nambudiri Brahmin are sort of looked down upon by the Tamil Brahmin. And the Nambudiri will look down further on the Tamil Brahmin. So, you know, there's so much divergence, there's so much diversity and difference. And what we did in 1947 and 1950 was to accept, we will agree that everybody is different, but we'll create a framework where all the difference can exist. In the common zone, in the common areas, we will agree by certain ground rules. Otherwise, let everybody be different. Why does it matter? And why does it matter? You know, why must we all have one language and one format and one set of clothes and one set of foods we eat and all of that?
In that context, do you think that coalition governments are a better future for India than any one party?
I think coalition governments are somewhat more attuned to the cultural realities of the country. Because especially the more state parties there are, the state parties' constituencies are local. They're in various states. And those states are defined on the basis of common linguistic zones and so on. So that gives, I think, a greater accommodation, a greater flexibility to government itself. Already, as I said, you know, there's also a major north bias in the way politics is done. Look at this distribution of seats in parliament. Kerala is one of the most advanced states socially, but it only sends 19 MPs to parliament. The Bimaru states, as it were, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, they have a huge chunk in parliament. Uttar Pradesh sends about 80 MPs to parliament. So when it comes to influencing lobbies in parliament, getting certain laws passed, certain states have a huge influence on parliament and what kind of policies are made. Other states may have better policy ideas, but they don't have the clout in parliament to push that through. So that also has political repercussions. So we are a complicated country. We are a country, it is an experiment even underway now. As I said, 70 years in the larger scheme of things in history is the blink of an eye. You know, great empires have fallen in 100 years. You know, so 70 years is nothing, really. So if we want to preserve it, if we want to go ahead as we are just now, we have to continue to keep our faith in the Constitution. We have to resist these attempts to sort of insist that we must be one kind of person and in one kind of format. That has to be resisted. I think coalition governments are perhaps more alive to this because their own political future depends on it.
Yes, because I've heard this notion of India moving to coalition themes in 1989, and it's still not happened in a sense because all these vicious changes happen over collective thinking.
In 1947 also, when the princely states were integrated with India, at that time the plan very much was that defense, communications, national security, things like that would be controlled by the central government, and eventually power would be devolved to the states. At the end of the day, the vision we have officially is that decentralization. Keep a few core things for the center, for the overall framework of the union. India is a union of states. In reality, power must vest with the states, but we haven't got there yet. Our current Prime Minister promised it when he wanted to come to power, but now that he's in power, he seems to also enjoy holding as much power in the centre, which all Prime Ministers prefer.
All do it.
One of the things that you mentioned is how we learn history in a certain way. Isn't that something that states could control? I mean, why would southern states learn more about North Indian
No,
history?
they don't. In the sense that states do have some say
So
on
is that the
textbooks.
right way to do it? Are there other models that you've looked at in other countries that also
No.
might be struggling with the same kind of
So
domination
you know,
of history?
other countries often have one advantage, which is that no country as such is as diverse as ours. So you know, you have a UK system, for example. It's a tiny island. I mean, they have a Wales and a Scotland, but that's not really as diverse as India is, for example. In India, the level gets far more complicated because not only is there a different language, there's a different settled identity. Then you have the caste factor. So all of this comes in, and whose history are you telling at the end of the day? So all of that exists. I would never put my faith in textbooks in general because I have some sympathy for the textbook writer. When you're told to cram Indian history into 50 pages, how on earth are you going to do it? From the northeast to Kashmir to the Punjab and Kerala with our matrilineal queens and all of that, how are you going to cram all of it? So they reduce it to its bare bones and throw in ingredients in this haphazard manner, add a few dates, add a few battles, done. And even the states, within the states there's so much diversity. Again, there's a control on who tells the history. Often what we think of as pure Indian culture, this often happens in Pune. I grew up, and the Marathi we learnt in school, it was only much later that I realized it was a Brahmin Marathi. It was that Pune Kokanastha Brahmin Marathi that we were taught. Because I've had Maratha friends who speak a very different Marathi. The inflections are very different. But that's not considered pure enough for textbooks. So there's so much politics and so many layers in all of this that writing a textbook is not an easy task. So I would rather have inculcate the habit of reading in people in general and hope they pick up books like mine and read that, then go for textbooks and government intervention. Governments and textbooks have done enough damage. More government intervention is the last thing one needs.
But attitude of history also changes. Like, Shivaji might be a very important figure here, but in Bengal, we don't look at Shivaji as a good guy at all.
The Marathas were villains in Bengal because they raided.
So
No,
the textbook also reflects that.
Also here in the 19th century, Phule Shivaji was Shivaji who stood up for the downtrodden. Tilak Shivaji was the Shivaji who stood up for Brahmins and cows. So that in the same state, in the same city, two people came up with two different Shivajis. So this is a constant thing that exists in India. It's not easy to negotiate this.
Question here. So, as you do your research on the two books and future books, is all your material available in English, or are you very strong in?
Depends on what kind of material. So, yeah, my first book, for example, because it deals with the colonial era, 19th and 20th century Travancore, by then it was well integrated into the colonial system. So as I said, 1860s, Maharani of Travancore's private love letters to her husband are written in English. They were written in English simply because she didn't want her servants to read it. But for me it was an advantage because it was in English. The state manuals are in English, the census reports are in English, the annual administrative reports from the 1860s, they're all in English. The official records of the government of India, which is in Delhi, the British government, they're in English. So for me, 80% of my material, specifically because I was dealing with the colonial era, they were in English. So it was easy that way. If I go further back in time, I have to deal with Malayalam, which I don't have the skills for, so I'm never going to venture there. With my Deccan book, for example, the issue was a little more complicated because you have Telugu, Kannada, Tamil, Marathi and Sanskrit, and Arabic and Persian. So all these languages. So a historian can't learn all these languages. I can do Marathi, I can do some Hindi, but Hindi doesn't really feature that much. For everything else, I relied on the latest acclaimed academic translations that existed. So you rely on, there's no other way. How many languages will you end up learning? It does add a level there, adds a filter there, because how the translator translated something matters. As I said, William Jones translating Shakuntala and leaving out her breasts is one important, it's a significant thing, because you're sanitizing the text as per your cultural ideologies. So there are some issues like that in translation. At the end of the day, historians have to work with what they can and what material is available. Learning 7 languages and then trying is not easy. At most you can learn 2-3 languages, but yeah.
Yeah, I have 2 quick questions. One is a little technical related to your Deccan Sultans. Now, I'm a little confused here. Chand Bibi, when she ceded Berar to Murad, if I'm not mistaken, she then got together with the Golconda and the Vijayanagar kingdom. And
not Vijayanagar
kingdom.
Yeah, Vijayanagar.
And they had a battle on the river Godavari.
Where they lost.
The Mughals won. So then, wasn't that a defining or rather decisive battle for the Mughals? Why did Akbar then have to return to the Deccan a year later?
The thing is, so these are all shifting alliances, right? So it depends entirely on who controls the forts. You have a battle next to a river, but your treasure's all sitting in the fort. At the end of the day, these are military states. Control over resources, control over gold, control over money, these are the things that matter. And the thing is, the Deccan was also unfamiliar terrain for the Mughals. They come in with these huge armies, and you have this wonderful quote towards the end of the book, I have it, where one of these chroniclers talks about how these massive Mughal armies are walking into the Deccan. And in those days, armies didn't come with just soldiers. There were dance singers, there were traders. It was a huge enterprise that moved. So you'd have a regular soldier. His gun would be up. He'd probably have a ladle or something stuck into it, because his wife would be at the back with a thing on her head, and the man would also have a baby on his side. And before they knew it, a Maratha band would appear on horses, wipe off this man's, cut off his head, and they'd be gone in 5 minutes. Because these were people who attacked very quickly. They knew the hills, they knew the ghats, and these Mughal armies that were so slow moving with their big camps and tents, they were unable to deal with it. Which is why they were so fixed on. The thing is, even though they defeated these people at the Godavari battle, much treasure didn't fall into their hands, and the fort didn't fall into their hands. You control the fort, you control the treasury. Then you place your agent there. Which also was never always a guarantee, because the early Delhi Sultans, how did the Bahmani state happen? Every governor they sent into the Deccan, they realized, Acha, Delhi is very far away, I'll just declare independence. You shut the fort gates, declare independence, and then there's a siege. Aurangzeb, even when he defeated Golconda has never been taken in any siege. It was finally betrayal. The gates were opened. So at the end of the day, these battles that happen on the peripheries.
In John Bibi's case, I think the same thing happened.
Yeah, because she was killed. She was killed first, and they had no option.
A eunuch of hers or something like that.
He stabbed her.
Betrayed her.
Yeah, because she was coming to terms with the Mughals.
Because
She realized that she had no option but to come to terms, because they'd starved to death.
Right.
You have all the gold, but you can't eat it. So
Right.
there's also that factor. So Aurangzeb in Golconda, he was there for nearly a year.
So then why did Akbar himself have to come all the way?
Akbar didn't come all the way eventually. He came all the way to the Deccan, but he didn't actually enter. He went back because he was unwell, and he asked Danial to then lead the thing.
Danial
Yeah.
with Khane Khane.
Yeah.
And the second question is, yours is historical non-fiction. Now when somebody is writing historical fiction, are you agreeable with the fact that the writer can take certain creative liberties with?
I would excuse it for the simple reason that, as I said, the further back you go in time, your material becomes very sparse. So you have at some level to So Ibrahim Adil Shah, he liked Saraswati, he dressed this way, he spoke more Marathi than he did Persian, much to the surprise of Mughal ambassadors who found that the Adil Shah has no real knowledge of Persian. So based on that, you can conjecture that he was a charismatic figure, he was interested in the arts, because he had a Renaissance painter come in, he had these veena playing women around him. Then you say, acha, he was a big patron of music. So you can connect some dots that way. But again, you go further back in time, how do you connect dots? Because the material is so slender. Like a Razia Sultan, you only have the broad outline of her life, who she was as a person, what her character was. You don't really have much to play with. In those cases, you end up taking creative leaps. Sometimes you take back creative leaps.
What about the different interpretations? Like, suppose Rani Lakshmibai, a Britisher would be writing differently about her, and an Indian academician would be writing differently.
Luckily, with Rani Lakshmibai, we have plenty of material. I wrote a column recently about how she only joined the revolt in 1858,
Yes.
not immediately in 1857.
Yes.
She was still negotiating with the British, and it was only when finally she realized they were not going to let her have her way that she joined forces with the rebels when she had no other option. And she in the beginning she was calling the rebels evil people, and she was completely criticizing the rebels at the start. But there was this novel that came out by Jayashree Mishra a few years ago,
I know.
and that caused a
That
huge
was banned.
issue. Yeah, it was banned in the
She had
state
an
and all of
affair
that.
with the English, with
Yeah.
the English
Yeah.
resident at that time.
Which
Was what
the thing is, the complaint that this shouldn't have been said. It's an interesting one because the British from the start, or Europeans in general from the start, as I said, they didn't have access to the zenana. So they always mystified the zenana in this interesting way. So in Travancore, there's the story of the 17th century queen called Umayama, where the British sent her tribute one year from Anjango, their enclave that she'd given them. And among the gifts was a beautiful Englishman who spent 3 months with her, and then she sent him back loaded with riches and all of that. It may be true because matrilineal queens had the sexual freedom to do what they pleased. But it is also the British, they had this voyeuristic tendency also.
Yeah.
There was a voyeuristic tendency. So the British would also encourage rumors that look at these queens, they're trapped in these harems, and they're so sensuous and they don't have enough men in their lives, and therefore one white man comes along and suddenly she's going all gaga about him. There was British propaganda there. They tended to do that. So to that extent,
Joyce Lebra Chapman in her book
on Lakshmi Bai.
on Lakshmi Bai has actually alluded to that, saying that though we as Indians we revere Lakshmi Bai, but she did tie her white sari in a specific way when she had to negotiate with the British, not really saying that, you know, she was sexual in any way, but, you know, the way she appeared and the way she tied her sari. So now that's a different interpretation which wouldn't go down very well
It
with
wouldn't.
Indians.
And it's not surprising either. See, the thing is, when you're doing diplomacy, you use all your gifts, right? And women were already not allowed in the main spaces of politics. You couldn't go into the regular darbars, you couldn't go into the regular spaces where politics was negotiated. So the harems were powerful influences because that's the space the women controlled. That's the space that they had their own jagirs, they had their revenues. Akbar's mother, the so-called Jodhabai, Maryam Zamani, you know, she had
Akbar's
Jahangir's, Akbar's wife.
Akbar's
Yeah, sorry, not mother, wife. She had a huge shipping enterprise. She had some of the biggest ships that were sailing in the Arabian Sea and the Red Sea and so on. They were her ships. She had huge. She had a major say in policy. When an Englishman went and outbid her at an auction for indigo, she was furious and she got that man thrown out of court. You know, the English in general thrown out of court. So the women did have various ways of exercising influence, and in that, using their femininity was not necessarily a bad thing, because a masculine space with arms and armor that the men did. The women did the other thing. They could go where the men couldn't. They could negotiate in private. So, you know, when Akbar's son Jahangir is in rebellion, the women of the harem were prepared. One of his aunts, one of his stepmothers or somebody,
Salima Begum and,
correct, goes out on an elephant to try and tell him, you know, calm the hell down and come back to your father. If the emperor himself had gone, he would have had no option but to imprison him. But because she went as an aunt or as a female member of the family, she could therefore use that to sort of patch this over quietly. So, you know, they did have a role to play, and femininity had its own advantages, many disadvantages. It was disadvantaged in general, but it could, women in positions of influence could use it to their advantage.
But would our Indian audience accept?
Our Indian audience sadly will not accept many things. So, you know, it's one of those things that we have to deal with.
We're gonna happen. We're gonna do 2 more questions. Yeah. Last 2. Ajay.
Okay. Like I said, that if you go back in history, the information is very sparse.
Yeah.
So we recently wanted to do the students start back with 300 BCE. So look at the Maurya and Gupta and those empires, and information is very hard to come by. How do you, or where do you get such information from if you really want to read about our history and be more knowledgeable, even when you are working with students all the way from, let's say, younger years into the older years, so that we can get them more than just what is in the book.
So, yeah, I mean, as I said, the material becomes sparser when you go back, but the way you deal with the material also changes. So, the Guptas, for example, you have poetry from the time, there's archaeological evidence. There's also, and this is one of the things, it was the British who, for example, connected Chandragupta Maurya with Sadracotus, who existed in the old records that they were familiar with from Europe and the Greeks and so on. So, there's all of that. So, you correspond it with other records, travelers, these things, because Chinese travelers came to India, Western travelers came to India, they left accounts. You try and figure out which one they're talking about, and that gives you a general sense. But it is to a great extent conjecture. It is to a great extent a slightly more complicated game of connecting the dots. It's not always easy, but slowly, you know, things are changes are shedding light. For example, on the whole issue of Harappa, you know, one of the things, forget the Guptas and all of them, Harappa, which is 4,000 years old. There's this huge debate about who they were, whether they were Aryans, you know, whether they were today's Indians and their ancestors. Luckily for us, we haven't deciphered the Harappan script, so we have no idea what their script was. But now genetic science is helping there, because they're looking at DNA from 4,000-year-old skeletons and figuring out that, hold on, they don't have the same genetic composition as people in that area now, which meant in the middle a new party came. But you also read this in association with existing texts. You can't read the Harappan thing, but you can read the Vedas. The Rig Veda, the other Vedas, the Rig Veda, if you look, it's a nomadic community that's being described. It's a community on the move that's being described. It's a community in which the horse is elevated to a great level of importance. Then you look at the Harappan seals, no horse appears at all. Every other animal appears, even the unicorn appears, but the horse doesn't appear. The Rig Veda is nomadic. Harappans lived in planned cities. Harappans didn't have kings. Rig Veda talks about, you know, certain things, certain ideas, which you don't find parallels in the Harappan evidence that there is. Harappans didn't have kings, and how do you know Harappans didn't have kings? Not because we have any records saying so, but we find that in the ruins of Harappa, there are no monuments, there are no palaces. Cities that are hundreds and thousands of miles away from each other, they all follow a same geometric pattern of construction. Whether it's a small house, it's a certain shape. It's a big house, it's the exact same shape in a much bigger size. There's no creativity, there's no mansions and statues and that sort of thing. It tells you that, hold on, kings tend to build monuments. Kings tend to build statues. Kings tend to stamp their name on a certain landscape, which is notoriously absent in Harappa. So the running theory is that a certain elite controlled it, no one dynasty or no one king or no one emperor. So you have to make these sort of conjectures. Similarly, in the in the Vedas, in the early Vedas, you find a lot of negative remarks about idol worshippers. It says smash the idols and things like that. I wonder what some people would say about that vis-a-vis the Muslims. But yes, so it says smash the idols and all that. But by the Atharva Veda, the idols are welcome. The palace worshippers is what they call the Harappans, and you find the Harappans were palace worshippers. So clearly there are indications of some kind of a conflict there. Perhaps over a period of centuries. It's not nobody's saying people came one fine morning and took over. But you find a 1,000-year period when there was a big back and forth happening. Similarly, languages. Now they're finding, Tony Joseph's book you should read, Old Elamite has massively striking trends with South Indian languages. There's the word eri, for example, in Old Elamite, and it means fire, and in Malayalam we say erikiga, to set something on fire. Kattil, that word also appears in Old Elamite. Lots of Dravidian language words have roots in Old Elamite. So linguistics, advanced studies in that, genetic studies, more and more archaeological evidence. They're having new excavations in Kiradi in Tamil Nadu. They have the Rakigadi excavations. They're having other stuff. Most of the Harappan spots have been found, but we don't have the funds to fully excavate them. That's the tragedy we're facing. So as more and more comes out, assume you find a Rosetta Stone for Harappa and you can finally decipher their script. It will be a huge leap. We have to wait and get there. But till then, historians can only connect the existing dots there are. We can't invent dots. Some historians of a certain leaning like to invent dots. Someone even tried to fabricate a Harappan seal, which was a Photoshop job. And he was caught out in the 90s. But yeah, we have to deal with what we have.
Harappans did have horse. Surkotada, this thing, they have found horse remains.
What resembles vaguely a horse. They're not sure it's horse. And the horse that appears in all those 90s books is the forged horse. The Photoshop horse.
No, I'm not talking about this. I am an archaeologist. I've actually worked on
This is the horse that's sort of disputed. No?
In the last few years, there have been a number of genetic studies, and it's not something resembling a horse, it's a real horse.
Is it?
Yes.
Interesting. Always
We've
more
got,
light.
we've got one last
material.
question. That Manu is a font of, fun and passion and, knowledge and history, but, we'll have to cut it short today. Yeah? We will love to invite Manu again. Manu, we'd love to have you back again. In fact, I think we're gonna end it. Manu, I think personally for me, what I take away from this evening is your passion for what you do. Personally, I don't think I'm ever going to be a historian, but I can take the passion, the joy, the kind of the depth that you've gone into what you do and sort of apply it into my life. So it's really amazing to have you here. The inspiration I think is for many people who are here, and we've got young people, we've got people who are practicing, in their different professions. But I think we can all take that, inspiration from the way you've been, so going into things in depth and really being a subject expert on what you do. So thanks for that. Thanks for that inspiration.
Thanks for having me, and thank you for patiently listening.
Thanks so much. Thank you all for coming. Just one last thing. We are rounding up this sort of tri-series of talks on history with Parvati Sharma in 2 weeks' time. That's on the 23rd. Most welcome to come. She'll be here. We're hoping, and y'all could encourage Manu to be here. We're going to do a Q&A with in conversation with Manu and Parvati on the 23rd. So that'll be great fun. That's the plan.